Okay, so as I said, my name is Marty from Better Futures Australia. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're all joining this call from First Nations countries. So for me, it's the Gadigal land and the Eora Nation in Sydney that I now have the privilege to call my home, and I pay deep respects to elders past and present. I invite everybody to use the chat function to share what country you're currently joining from. And before I introduce the amazing panelists that we have here, I'd like to share a quick introduction about Better Futures Australia, which I will shorten to BFA. BFA is a non-partisan alliance of climate champions from every sector of society and the economy who are demonstrating readiness to work with the new government to over-deliver on Australia's climate commitments. We're privileged to work with a range of sector working groups to reach consensus on climate action. The National Better Futures Forum in September this year will be an opportunity to set an ambitious national climate agenda that puts us on track for climate resilient, zero emissions and better futures. This policy dialogue is one of a series to start building on critical conversations that need to see commitments to collaborative action plans to come out of that forum. I'd like to thank Beth Richards for her hard work and dedication in assembling the information and the amazing speakers here today. I'm going to stop this, and now we have 4 inspiring individuals joining us, and a huge thanks to all of them taking time to join us today. Tennant Reid is the Principal National Advisor for the Australian Industry Group. Tennant advises AI Group's leaders on energy and climate policy, energy supply, prices and efficiency, a fun job to have at the moment, and previously was an advisor in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. Mindy Leow is the Head of Impact Growth for B-Lab Australia, Torreya and New Zealand, and she works to grow the the B Corp community and scale their impact outside of certification, and is also a member of the BFA Steering Committee. Coral Bravo, a senior analyst at the Climate Works Centre, leads data gathering and analysis for Climate Works' Net Zero Momentum Tracker project, the first project ever to centralise data and track Australia's progress towards net zero emissions across key sectors of the economy. And Danny Su from the Investor Group on Climate Change. Danny is a sustainability and corporate reporting specialist with experience in providing ESG and investor-related consulting services for ASX-listed companies, advice, reporting, climate risk assessments, and strategy. As I said, there is a chat function on the side, so please feel free to introduce where you're joining from and what information you're providing. We'll also be putting links to the amazing panelists, but I'm sure you'd love to hear from them. So I'd like to invite Tennant to open the dialogue, presenting his recent work with the AI Group.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to share some slides. I'm going to set myself a firm 5-minute deadline, and I'm going to try and cover a few different issues of interest here, starting with the opportunities and the role that industry has in the transition to net zero emissions, a bit about drivers then of that, including the potential for the safeguard mechanism to play a role, the relevance that carbon border adjustment mechanisms may have, and the driver of energy cost. So let's step into it. One thing that comes across from the IPCC's 6th assessment report, the elements of that looking at opportunities for industry, is that we do need to have a broader perspective than we may have had in the past on how decarbonisation in industry works. It's not just about what happens within the factory. It's also about the demand for and the use of and the end of life and subsequent life of the products that they make. So I'm going to talk mostly about what happens in the factory, but I'm just putting a pin in that we do need to look beyond that as well for a strategy that can deliver the rate of global decarbonisation that we need. Now, the IPCC suggests that there is, There are different pathways that are possible and modelable to get to a global trajectory consistent with well below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. There are some differences between those pathways, but there's also indications that quite a lot is achievable within industry in the coming decade and beyond. If we look at some of the specific opportunities that they address in some major sectors, I've picked out 3 here: cement, steel, and primary chemicals. Now, the technical pathways differ, but the features that are common are that there is likely to be, for many of these, an increase in production cost that is competitively significant within those sectors and supply chains, but does not turn into a large cost increase for end users. That is, there's so many factors that go into, say, the cost of a car, which incorporates a bunch of steel and other emissions, currently emissions-intensive materials, that if the production cost of zero emission steel is potentially 10% to 50% above the production cost of high emission steel, still only turns to a less than 1% increase in the cost of the final car to a consumer. So that is quite important because it suggests both that the trade competitiveness concerns in a messy world that is moving in different ways at different speeds towards where we all need to go, they are real, but also that they are addressable while still doing the transition and having an acceptable cost to end users. So the safeguard mechanism is the main game today in discussion of how is an industry going to be able to invest and driven to invest in these pathways. And I've just come out of like a 2-hour discussion of all sorts of design complexities for the safeguard mechanism. There's a lot. But the bit that people are probably going to argue about the most is how do you address trade competitiveness concerns? So all the economies that apply a meaningful carbon price at this point have some kind of mechanism to address trade exposure to avoid a loss of competitiveness for their most trade exposed industries. And those approaches largely amount to free allocation of emissions permits, which is a system that has some limitations over time and is quite costly. It's been effective-ish to date. The European Union is moving towards, it looks like, a carbon border adjustment mechanism instead of that free allocation. But none of them allow a complete price signal to trade exposed industries yet. We face a bunch of options in the safeguard. We could think about a border adjustment of our own. We could talk about the rate of decline of baselines in the safeguard mechanism. There's a lot of options there, but I think we're going to spend a lot of oxygen arguing about them. That has been 5 minutes. So just briefly on CBAMs, they're really interesting. They impose a domestic carbon price on imports, potentially rebate that price on exports of relevant products. And we've done some initial analysis of how Australia might be impacted by Europe's CBAM. There's a lot of detail, but the key point is that if every potential supplier to an EU consumer of relevant goods faces a carbon price, either within Europe from their own ETS, at the border through a CBAM, or they bear those higher production costs associated with a zero emissions product, there's no way the consumer can get a product that isn't paying some kind of carbon premium. So selling prices are going to increase for these products inside Europe. And once you take account of that, CBAM doesn't look like a threat or a immediate you're out of business story for exporters to Europe. What it is instead is a level playing field. And if you can keep up with the pace of decarbonisation within Europe's market, you'll be fine. You'll be no less profitable than you are today. If you're ahead of the game, you might be more profitable. If you do fall behind, you will be less competitive in that market. And my very final thing is that another driver for this transition is that conventional energy has gone through the roof in terms of cost. This is a very simplistic depiction of the energy cost as a share of value added for a bunch of Australian industry sectors. Many of them, not a big deal, the movements that have happened today. Everybody will notice if your electricity or gas bill doubles. But the difference that it makes varies. Some industries are incredibly exposed, and transition off coal-fired electricity and gas for energy has become very urgent. And I'll stop there.
Wow, thank you so much. And I think that each one of our speakers could probably teach a week-long webinar. So thank you for keeping time on that. And there are links in our chat if people would like to follow up and find out more information on each of our speakers. I'll now ask Mindy to present on B Corp and the community and what they're asking to be included within an ambitious climate agenda for Australian business.
Thank you, Marty. And let me share my screen. Hopefully you can see. Hello, everyone. I'm Mindy Leow, and today I'm speaking on behalf of the B Corp Climate Collective, a volunteer-led initiative powered by certified B Corps. Joining the collective is not a requirement for certification, and therefore the consolidated views today are contributions from the collective who do not represent all 440 B Corps in the region. Tennant, you are a very hard act to follow, but let me dive right in. So far, businesses have defined climate action in Australia, and learning from international examples, here are some actions that the Australian government can take. Firstly, is to promote low emissions industries. The delay in climate action is hurting businesses. Without pointing fingers, failing to act on climate change and being slow to promote low emissions industries, Australia is missing out on economic opportunities as global demand for clean products accelerates. For example, Sweden is providing green steel for Volvo, while the Canadian government has ambitions to partner with industry to be a leader in carbon neutral cement. Australia could grow its revenue from green exports such as hydrogen and steel to 333 billion by 2050, almost tripling the value of existing fossil fuel exports. Secondly, legislate net zero. Businesses need investment certainty. And while businesses recognize the need to act on climate, many are slowed down by a lack of clear long-term signals. That's why legislating a science-based net zero ambition is crucial. The UK Climate Change Committee is an independent statutory body established under the Climate Change Act 2008. The Climate Change Committee's purpose is to advise policy markets on emission targets and make progress reports to Parliament. At the state level, this is already well underway. In 2007, South Australia pioneered what is now considered best practice climate legislation around a 2050 emissions reduction target. It is time for the federal government to get us back on track. It is also time for the government to move on the clean energy transition. In 2020, as the world grapples with COVID, Germany produced more energy from renewables than from fossil fuels. And this has come from decades of policy debates and trials, which we can learn from. Germany's transition, also known as Energiewende, pardon my German, is a great example of how a major economy weans off fossil fuels and nuclear energy whilst dealing with complex issues not dissimilar to ours, including an old power grid, the utility sector, mobility, energy costs, and impact on jobs. This transition is actually very well documented at cleanenergywire.org. Just search for Energiewende Easy Guide. Fourth, remove fossil fuel subsidies. Fossil fuel subsidies cost Australians $10.3 billion last financial year. It is the 18th largest cost in the budget, more than the Army or Air Force. Subsidies distort the market and deter required investments in renewables, making it impossible to compete on an even playing field. In January 2018, the European Parliament voted in favor of reporting on progress of phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. Earlier this year, President Biden also addressed tackling fossil fuel subsidies in his executive order and in his recent infrastructure package and tax plan. Can and will Australia follow? 5, enforce energy efficiency. Energy prices are going to go up before they come down, and businesses need to plan for the net zero transition. Energy efficiency reduces the amount of energy needed by business to make products and deliver services, thus reducing energy demand and subsequently costs. Chile passed energy efficiency legislation in January 2021. It's called the Energy Efficiency Law, and it has an economy-wide reduction target of 10% by 2030 compared to 2019 levels. 6, promote circular economy. We work with companies in the construction industry who would like to see support for a circular economy to better source building materials for reuse and recycle. The benefits of circularity extends beyond the building industry and has immense benefits given finite resources. There are a range of levers for government, including passing new laws, increasing land levies, landfill levies, providing incentives, support mechanisms, investing in innovation hubs, as well as public procurement that can all encourage collaboration and spark investment. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation's website has an entire section dedicated to sharing policy resources, and Regen Melbourne, whom B-Lab is a partner, is also garnering world attention as a community-led effort to build a circular economy. Lastly, 7, upgrade reporting requirements. While considering climate change in business and investment decision-making is becoming a norm, many are confused by how best to credibly report on ESG progress. The market wants a uniform set of standards for measuring and reporting, just as we have for financial performance. We welcome mandatory TCFD-aligned disclosures in Australia, and we want government to set higher levels of regulation for all companies, not just for the financial sector, to tackle greenwashing and unsubstantiated social and environmental claims in every sector. A good example of this overseas is the Green Claims Code developed by the ACCC equivalent in the UK to help companies avoid misleading consumers. So with that, I think I've used up all my time, but I do want to highlight the contributions of BWD Strategic, Intrepid, Koskela, Verticon, Biopac, Future Super, and Edge Environment for their contributions to this dialogue. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Marty. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mindy. And there are links on the side for everybody who's interested. There's going to be a lot of tabs open, which is a constant discussion for people in our workplace, but there's a lot of follow-up reading to be done. I'd now like to welcome Coral, who'll tell us about what Australian businesses need on their decarbonisation journeys from your perspective.
Thank you, Marty. Hello, everyone. And yeah, today I want to start by referring to my experience from the past 3 years, looking into and assessing Australian corporate climate commitments, mostly as part of the Net Zero Momentum Tracker initiative. And last year, as part of this initiative, we published the Corporate Action for 1.5 Degrees Best Practice report, which highlights 4 principles that demonstrate best practice in terms of climate commitments. These are, first, having a long-term net zero commitment by or before 2050. Second, having at least one ambitious medium-term target. Third, that these commitments should address all material emissions across the value chain. And lastly, that they should be supported by tangible near-term actions. The good news is that since we first started this initiative back in 2019, we have seen a proliferation of net zero commitments in corporate Australia. However, not all commitments are equal. Our analysis found that commitments are varied in the language, scope, coverage, and importantly, the level of ambition. It is evidence that guidance and support is needed. So today I want to highlight specifically the need for, first of all, consistency in reporting and disclosure. 2, target setting along action driven by ambitious corporate strategies. And this is related to my third point, clarity on the use of offsets, and fourth, collaboration. So to explain these points in detail, I'm going to refer back to the findings of this best practice report I was talking about. So first of all, we identified a lack of clarity around corporate commitments driven by an inconsistency in reporting. The high number of standards and criteria available for corporates make it difficult to take up good practices. So by making reporting mandatory using the TCFD or an equivalent framework and providing guidance on the resources to be used, regulators can support corporate transition. And the UK, EU, Japan, these are just some examples of governments that have made climate disclosures mandatory for corporates. And in Australia, it's also now under consideration for large corporations and financial institutions. Also in Australia, the Corporate Emission Reduction Transparency Report is a good start for transparency and standardization. It allows companies to consistently present progress to their climate commitments, and with some improvements, for example, including Scope 3 emissions, it would support businesses even better. The CERT is also able to validate the use and retirement of certificate schemes. This is important given the current perception of corporate greenwashing and the questions around carbon offsets, which leads me to my next point. The best practice report highlights that offsets should only be reserved for unavoidable emissions. So mechanisms that provide clarity, support the transparency of carbon offsets use are needed. And we see some organizations that are looking to provide some clarity in this space, such as the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative's recent draft on claims code of practice. So to avoid an over-reliance on offsets, ambitious corporate strategies must be developed. These must be appropriate for the sector a company operates in. And for example, to assess the alignment of corporate commitments, we use ClimateWorks' Decarbonization's Future All-In scenario, which models a pathway for Australia as a whole to reach net zero by 2035, in line with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, and the contribution of each sector. The government can support corporates to develop their strategies and facilitate the implementation of these by developing sector-specific commitments and strategies. For example, by setting renewable energy targets along system plans for the electricity system, and supporting the road vehicle fleet transformation by introducing vehicle standards, deploying financial incentives and targets for EVs. And some of these are already being considered here in Australia by the new government, or also in industry, as Sinan was pointed out before. There are plans to strengthen the safeguard mechanism, so it's recognizing that it is critical to incentivize those high-emitting companies to further reduce their emissions. So setting such regulations and policies, signaling where governmental support will be given, can facilitate and speed up Australia's decarbonization. And just to finalize, I want to mention also the importance of collaboration. As I said before, we have seen corporates taking action on climate, but until now, these efforts have mostly been done in silo. There's still a lot of work to do and a lot of questions to address, but the thing is that we don't have a lot of time. 2030 is an important milestone for climate action. So we need businesses, government, investors, the community, all working together, improving transparency and clarity around climate reporting, setting ambitious targets at a national, state, sectoral, and corporate level that are all in line with each other and supported by strong and tangible actions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just to remind everyone that Coral's work was a first project to centralize data and track Australia's progress towards net zero emissions. And I think that is so crucial at the moment going forward. So thank you for the presentation and all the amazing work that ClimateWorks is doing. Finally, now to Danny to speak from an investor perspective, touching on corporate emissions reporting and the IPCC's Climate Transition Plan report.
Thanks, Marty. Hi, everyone. I'm Danny. I work at IGCC. And IGCC represents investors with funds under management globally of around 33 trillion. So it's very much that investor's perspective. And we have a lot of the world's largest asset managers and Australian superannuation funds as part of our membership base. So the ASX is one of the world's most carbon intensive exchanges in the world. It has an enormous risk of capital flight. So what investors are really looking for from companies in Australia, as well as governments, is a way to ensure that they get a stable long-term return from their investments in a way that's aligned with net zero. That means seeing consistent signals from governments to unlock huge opportunities for investors and create shareholder value, as well as value for companies, communities, and protecting the retirement savings of Australians. This is particularly important for Australia given mandatory superannuation rules, which means we have a very large proportion of superannuation in this market. So investors globally, they are interested in setting net zero goals. There's a whole range of investor initiatives that mean that they're setting net zero targets for their own portfolios, which has arisen initiatives like Climate Action 100. It's one of the world's largest investor-led climate initiatives. IGCC facilitates the Australian arm of that. And this initiative really is about corporate engagement, so engaging with their investments, as well as a public benchmark which releases the assessments of 166, I believe, of the world's highest emitting global companies, although strategically placed. And all of this has led to companies really increasing climate ambition and disclosure because their shareholders are asking for it. So as a result, we did put out a recent report. It's the Climate Transition Plans report, and it sets out investor expectations for companies wanting to align with net zero, as well as produce climate transition reports. And similar to Coral, it has 5 principles. It's setting science-based targets, disclosing appropriate strategies so that investors can actually understand how companies will achieve those targets, making sure that they are sector specific, disclosing investment commitments to ensure that we're getting the real world emissions reduction and not just long-term commitments, and also regular reporting requirements. So under each of these principles, there are more granular detailed expectations. There's about 5 to 10, and they're things like the percentage of emissions that should be reported or when targets should be rebaselined. And it really consolidates existing guidance already out there. So there shouldn't be anything too new in there. It should draw from things like Climate Action 100's benchmark methodology, SBTI's methodology, and it's been supported by a range of investors and investor networks. So if you do look at the report, the standards set are very high. I wouldn't expect any company to be meeting all of the requirements, but it is something for companies to try and work towards as they mature in their climate strategy. Some of those expectations are easy, some of them are hard. And you can take a guess which ones are hard. They're value chain emissions and capital allocation. And then just in terms of emissions reporting, and what I'm hearing investors are really looking for is that there is quite a big risk of underreporting of methane. So methane is critical in the Australian market. The Australian oil and gas companies are pure play oil and gas companies. They don't have much room to diversify. And there's new research popping up showing that based on satellite data rather than reported data by a company, it's up to 30% underreported, and methane is absolutely critical, particularly if the world begins to move towards producing hydrogen, in particular blue hydrogen, which also leads to the second point, which is double counting of offsets. So making sure when we have classifications for hydrogen, whether offsets are or are not included and whether they should be used to actually create blue hydrogen. And I might just stop there.
Thank you so much. And it is always so important to think about the entire investment and the whole process that goes through. And sometimes these processes aren't just a simple case of moving funding from one place to another. I'd like to now welcome Beth to ask some questions from our panelists. Just quickly to let everyone know that Beth has compiled reports on all of this and has pulled this entire panel together. So I'm living in very capable hands. Thank you very much, and over to you.
Thanks, Marty, and thanks again to our panel. So yes, I'm just going to ask some questions now. Please feel free, people listening in, to add to the list. But yes, if you could limit your responses to just a few minutes so other panelists can jump in and add into the conversation, that'd be great. So I'd like to start off with a question for Tennant. Would Australia benefit from introducing its own CBAM in light of other countries doing the same thing?
So it'd be pretty interesting. So a CBAM is an actually pretty elegant solution to a lot of the challenges that you've got around competitiveness, where you don't want to lose industry, but also you don't want to have just no policy and no incentive for investment in abatement. It's pretty distant from where we have been on trade policy. I reckon we're probably going to learn from the Europeans and whatever mistakes that they make in designing theirs, just like we learnt and everybody else learnt from the mistakes they made in the early stages of their emissions trading scheme. And a few years down the track, we might well be talking seriously about an Australian CBAM. Of course, to have a border adjustment, you've got to have something meaningful domestically to adjust for. And so that really depends on what happens with the safeguard mechanism, and does that become a meaningful driver of domestic abatement as the government proposes and we support.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tennant. Does anyone have anything to add from the panel? All right, on to the next question then. So this one's for Mindy. Since many of the states have climate change acts already, how would you suggest that the federal government works with states and businesses to legislate on the topics that you spoke about today?
Yeah, I think it's, working together is really important, because this is a whole of economy and all of civil society and government initiative as well. So I think definitely it's having really open conversation and really ending the climate wars in the country. So I think businesses have also responsibility to kind of make their needs and wants heard, and similar to citizens can engage with sort of various levels of government in expressing their views.
Brilliant. Does anyone have anything else to add to that? All right, so one for Coral, well, two actually. How should the government work with companies who are the most ambitious in their climate reporting and target setting to ensure that regulation doesn't water down their approach?
Yeah, so I think I say this from both perspectives. So also, yeah, the government engaging with companies, so making sure that they're involved in all engagement activities. When thinking about policies, okay, we have to include corporates as well as a community and everyone that can be impacted by this, but also the part of the corporates. So in this best practice report I've been talking about, we highlight some of the actions that corporates can take. And these are like two different kinds. So one is just saying like those that will have an immediate impact on emissions, and then also those that will create this enabling environment. So I think that's what's important here. So when talking about engagement, how is the company going to set up a proper strategy in terms of engagement and engaging with the government, but participating in alliances. So making sure that all different channels are being covered.
Okay, Tennant.
Yeah, I think that both sticks and carrots have places in all of this. We've talked a bit about the safeguard, which is most obviously a stick, but also in the ability to generate credits for performance below baseline could be a source of carrots as well. But we should also keep in mind another element of the federal government's election commitments, which is the National Reconstruction Fund, which has within it, it's got $15 billion of capital overall for loans, guarantees, and equity investments for a whole range of industrial transformation purposes. But within that, there's $3.5 billion earmarked for the clean energy transition, both the hard to abate sectors and supply chains for clean energy. So there's a lot of potential there to back in bold thinking and commitments by businesses that are critical to the transition that we've got to make, either the how do we get existing activity into a net zero world, or how do we take advantage of the new opportunities that come about in that world.
Brilliant. I have a question kind of leading on for that I'll open to everybody. So what do you think that the difficulties are in including Scope 3 emissions within reporting under the Corporate Emissions Reduction Transparency Report? Tennant, you're itching, go.
Who wants to go first? Scope 3 is really difficult. It's very important. It can't be ignored. Really constructive stuff comes from a focus on who do I need to work with in my supply chain to upstream or downstream to make a difference. There are some problems in emissions that probably can't be solved without collaboration between parties where the emissions are scope 1 and parties where they're the demand for those products. So that is important. But if you try and apply it in a hard and fast way, it's a fiesta of double counting and confusion, and it doesn't jibe well with compliance systems. So we've got to have in mind both things at once, that it's inescapable, but also very tricky in practice.
Danny, what do you think that investors want in terms of Scope 3 reporting? Have you heard much from the community on that?
Yeah, so Scope 3 is really tricky for companies. When Climate Action 100 looks at, well, its focus companies are the largest, so they're often the largest in the ASX as well. Even amongst those, we're seeing companies still only beginning the journey to reporting Scope 3. And Scope 3 methodology and reporting is also evolving, as well as you have different bodies like Climate Action 100 or SBTI defining what Scope 3 actually means and which Scope 3 emissions are actually material for companies to report on, as well as to set targets over. So it really is very tricky. And like Tennant said, the value chain is incredibly difficult in relation to CERT. When our companies look at Scope 3, particularly even if they are based in Australia, their value chain extends globally, which means, is the CERT actually able to capture Scope 3 emissions reductions from global suppliers or global customers? It is a little tricky. Don't know what the answer is, but investors are extremely concerned about Scope 3. It is generally a requirement for companies to report and set targets over Scope 3, particularly if they are material.
Mindy, did you have anything to add about how B Corps deal with Scope 3 emissions?
I think just echoing what Tennant and Danny both said, that Scope 3 is incredibly challenging, even for the kind of, the experts in the room here, and especially the community that we work with are very mostly small to medium enterprises too. So that is definitely, I think, also there's a journey and capability need there to learn from sort of leaders and bigger organizations in how to tackle. It's a big question.
Absolutely. Now, did anybody else from the panel have anything to add?
I would like to add that, along the same lines, but I think overall, at least amongst Australian corporates, we have seen, like Danny was saying, they're starting this journey around Scope 3 accounting, but we have been seeing progress, from recognizing their Scope 3 or their responsibility on scope 3 and then setting some boundaries. And now they're kind of thinking, okay, how do we measure it? And like the other panelists were saying, there's a challenge here because we need information from our supply chain, like from more people. So there's a lot of collaboration involved, and that's kind of what we need to tackle right now. Also thinking, like you were saying, like coming from the demand, supply, all of this and how it's involved. Maybe I would like to highlight what we've seen from my financial institutions here in terms of scope 3. So I think this has been a positive thing that we've seen, banks, super funds setting targets for their portfolio, which is basically their scope 3 emissions. It's a big part, really meaningful, and we're seeing commitments in that space. Like it's going to be interesting to see the actions and what's happening in the future and how they plan to achieve those targets, but we are seeing movement there.
That's fantastic to hear. Now, since we have a little bit of time, I'd just like to go through in speaking order. What would your top policy ask be to improve Australia's framework to support corporates on their decarbonisation journeys? Feel free to take a minute just to think, because Tennant, you'll be up first. I don't want to put you on the spot.
Well, I'll just lead off anyway. So I think if we're limiting it to 3, then a safeguard plus evolved safeguard that provides a pretty clear trajectory out for like 15 years or more, with, it's going to need to have some scope to evolve further. Targets and emissions ambition are going to keep evolving. And there's only one direction they're going to keep evolving in. But at a point in time, having a good bit of guidance for investment decisions by businesses in transformational change in their processes would be very helpful. Yes, there's a lot of work to do to get that nailed down, and particularly in time for the government's intended start date for this evolved safeguard is 1 July next year. That's not a lot of time, so we've really got to get our skates on. And then 2 and 3, I would say number 2 is actually to sort out emissions more definitively in the electricity sector. Electricity is an incredibly important enabler for decarbonisation in a lot of other sectors. And while we've all got this sort of assumption or confidence that things are headed in the right direction there's actually not a comprehensive policy solution that guarantees that will be the case. And getting that in place would probably make it a lot easier, for instance, to resolve the current debates about capacity mechanisms and means of ensuring investment in dispatchable capacity. If you're confident emissions are sorted, that reliability discussion gets a lot easier. And then number 3, the first 2 were a lot of work. But I would say a big push on helping businesses that are significant gas users to first reduce and then eliminate natural gas use as fast as is practical for them, because they're going to be paying through the nose for it for this decade, and they need to find solutions for a net zero trajectory anyway. It's going to be complicated and different, very much different strokes for different folks. If you're a feedstock user, that's very different than if you're running a boiler, but that's a really important area for activity. And the paybacks should actually be quite good, but government can help with capital availability and with information problems.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tennant. On to Mindy.
Great question, Beth. I presented a number of asks or wants from the community that I work with, the community of businesses. And I think maybe fundamentally what ties it all together is sort of having that a national legislation around the targets and a 2050 goal, or even sooner, right? According to the science, we need that sooner. And so, I know that the independent MP Zali Steggall has proposed a Climate Act or Climate Bill last year, which many in the B Corp community supported, and something like that, something where we can really know where we're headed, and then allow for the other policy settings to kind of fall in place as well for different industries, because we need that certainty. We want to see, we want to be able to plan for this transition. I think many want it, so it's really coming down to having a clear goal, yeah, so that would be my number one.
Very reasonable. Thank you. On to Coral with your suggestion.
Sure, thanks, Beth. So I have a couple of points that I want to mention. So first, what I was talking about before, the making climate disclosure mandatory. So using the TCFD, I think that's a good approach, and as we've heard, a lot of countries are making these mandatory. In the US, there are some proposals similar to these, and well, in Australia, we expect that to happen. But also, I want to highlight here that an initiative like similar to that is coming, the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures. So I think it's quite interesting now, also thinking about the risks and opportunities related to nature, thinking about the biodiversity loss and all of the ecosystem degradation. So, and similar to the conversation we were having before about scope 3, that is a bit kind of new probably, and we need collaboration. So I think we'll need also collaboration in this space. So if companies start thinking about it right now and thinking how they're going to capture this data, could be good. And well, maybe I won't go into detail because Tenant has talked about the safeguard mechanism and how it can be strengthened, but also kind of just recognizing the focus on industry that's currently happening. I think it's now in the G7 summit that they have agreed on creating this climate club to support ambitious countries to further reduce their decarbonization, but there's going to be a focus on industries, and then also understanding how some carbon prices mechanisms can impact other countries. So I think there's a lot of focus in this space right now. So it would be good for us to do something in this area as well.
Fantastic. We'll jump to Danny with her policy asks, and then I believe that Lisa's actually got a question for you, Coral.
Cool. So just 3, like Tenan mentioned, strong safeguard mechanism that actually achieves what it was set out to achieve, and tied into that, strong and credible offsets. So I'm sure we're all familiar with the issues currently surrounding offsets, but we need a deep and credible offset market. Policy should really be driving domestic abatement wherever it's efficient and internationally recognized. I'm not sure I could say that's currently the case or was previously the case. Mandatory reporting, of course, in alignment with net zero pathways for the different sectors. And then finally, what investors are really asking for, strong and long-term signals instead of these small or short-term media gathering bursts of funding that maybe don't set up the industry for the long term, so that companies and investors can plan for the future. Yeah.
Long-term certainty, I think, is the key point that we can all agree on here. And yes, Coral, we have a question for you. Can Australia follow New Zealand's lead in legislating task force on financial related disclosures and nature related disclosures?
I believe so, or want to believe so. I think always we can learn from others, from other countries that are already doing it. And not only has now the government said that this is being planned, like this is under consideration for large corporations and financial institutions, but also we are already seeing a lot of corporates doing it. So many of them are following, well, in case of the TCFD, they're already following these guidelines and reporting to the CDP that uses this framework. So yeah, I think corporates are set on this space, and now the TNFD will have a similar structure. So hopefully that will help corporates kind of to adopt this one as well, and just kind of will be just a transition into gathering new information.
Fantastic. I've heard a lot of talk around embedding sustainable development goals and using that as a framework for TCFD and TNFD reporting, but that might be wishful thinking on me and a few others' behalf. We have 2 more questions. So from Lisa. For Danny, we have, is there a role of an independent climate change authority for the long-term certainty?
Yeah, so there definitely is. The offset market has come under a bit of strain recently. So an independent review by the Climate Change Authority to, undertake a root and branch review of the Australian offset market would be critical to ensure the integrity of offsets and restore investor confidence in offset markets. There's a lot of movement within Australia, but also globally, to just limiting the reliance on offsets, which is possibly not the best option to go through, because there is definitely a time and place for the right use of offsets.
Yep. Well, thank you all so much for answering all of our questions. It has been enlightening. And yeah, thank you all again for coming out today to speak to us. I'll hand over to Marty to do the sign off. And tell you about the Better Futures Forum.
Thank you so much, Beth. And thank you so much to everyone that's joined and to our amazing panelists. If you want to find out more information, this is our website, betterfutures.org.au. I'd hope that you've visited it before if you managed to join this webinar. If you'd like to view some more events, there'll be another one next week on combating greenwashing in the corporate sector. Also, we have the Better Futures Forum coming up in Canberra. There are new dates. It has been moved to coincide more in line with the Parliament. So Tuesday the 6th and Wednesday the 7th of September. That is, again, on our website, betterfutures.org.au. And I'd like to plug the early bird registrations will close 31st of July, which is a 50% discount if people would like to book their tickets now. But thank you very much to Tenant, Mindy, Coral, Danny, and Beth for your generous time. And what an amazing session. I'm going to have to watch it about 3 times to digest all of the information. And I'm sure others were, but I was frantically writing down all the policy asks. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and thank you everybody for joining this session.